know what? I've been thinking about that Turn 1 sprint incident. In fact, you could say I've been stewing on it. I've come up with an idea for a brand new segment on this channel that if I find a particular incident that the stewards deemed a racing incident or something that I didn't quite agree with, that I might stew on it. What really inspired this is the material that I found online. The channel Scenario 8 made a really cool video breaking down the 4 different onboard cameras, which really helped me with my deduction for this video. So thank you so much, Scenario 8. I'll leave a link to the video here. If you like the sound of this type of formatted video, which might be a little bit more analytical than my regular videos, do drop a like and subscribe to find out what I tackle next. Okay, so that Miami Turn 1 incident. Ultimately, no one was given full blame. This was dubbed a Turn 1 incident where you can expect calamity to happen, and it did, resulting in Stroll and Norris retiring, Alonso with a puncture, and Hamilton, well, with, no seemingly major damage. So let's actually take a look at this. I've been gathering some notes from Scenario 8's video and the F1 Sprint Highlights video themselves. So this is how I view Turn 1, so this is my notes right here. The incident, I think, begins when Norris is trying to position himself on the outside for a pass around Stroll. He was probably positioning himself to maybe try and outbrake the Aston Martin, go around the outside, and then maybe see if he can then slot into Piastri afterward. He's probably feeling quite assured because at the time there is a decent amount of space between himself and Carlos Sainz a little bit further up the road. However, this all starts to get a little bit squiffy when Lance Stroll sees him and then cuts in to try and then almost push him into the wall, or at least just try and keep him behind. That's when things start to get a little bit tricky because, as we then see, Lando is about to hit the wall, and therefore I don't think he would like to hit the wall, so instead he hits on the brakes. Therefore, it does compromise his line in where he might be then going into a bit of a lockup, which then does push him out a little bit wide because he's also riding the curb, which again isn't ideal. But in the end, he is able to avoid rear-ending Stroll. You see, Lance, that's how you do it. Meanwhile, Hamilton is dive-bombing past Magnussen from 12th for a potential grab of 7th behind Ricciardo, since there is a huge space ahead. I don't question Lewis for trying to go for that gap because it's a big, juicy, huge gap. All the other drivers have pushed themselves over to the left, whereas Lewis has realised that, oh, there's a gap here, I'm going to have that. And also, he managed to get past Magnussen, and he doesn't come across Kevin for the rest of the race. Yeah, can you tell I'm lying? However, Alonso can see that Lewis is barreling into Turn 1, so therefore he's realising, as he says on the radio, Lewis went into that corner like a bull, so thusly he doesn't want to hit Lewis, so then he decides to move over to try and give him some room, because he knows that either he's going to lock up and then go straight on, or he's probably going to get the position, and then maybe Alonso can try and get him back further on into the sprint. Only for him to then clash into Stroll, who hasn't seen Alonso, and then continues to not see Alonso, and keeps sharply turning right. Personally, I think that Lance should have probably stopped turning right a little bit sooner. He was turning right more than necessary. So then the 2 Aston Martins are shimmering around, and it's painful to watch. And again, it's the cardinal sin. 2 drivers taking each other out of the same team. It made me cringe. But the most important thing to consider here is that with Stroll there, it's preventing Alonso from getting out of Lewis's way, which means that when Lewis does realise that, oh, Alonso's not moving, he then has to brake harder, and therefore he has a lockup, which means that they collide. Alonso becomes part of an Aston Martin Mercedes, well, it's a Mercedes sandwich basically, because they're all Mercedes powered, so he's left completely blindsided with a puncture, and it's a miracle that Alonso didn't get any major front wing damage, or did Lewis? Lewis seemingly got out of it scot-free. Lewis is almost at full right lock, probably bracing for an impact that doesn't really come before he then goes full right lock, and he continues. The shimmying between the Astons continues on for a lot longer than I anticipated, and then eventually Lance goes, oh yeah, maybe I should start turning left to get out of this, or whoever's trying to actually contact me, because I think he's probably still not aware it's Alonso. But when he does try and go left, he's then been jutted upwards, meaning the front wheels are off the ground, so then, you know, trying to turn, it's like Buemi in 2010 when his wheels came off. It's pointless, you can't turn, you're out of control. By the time he can start turning left, he then hits the ground, then goes, and then Lando's on his left, hopefully being able to get past Lance once and for all, and then there's no time for Lance to respond, and then they collide, which means that Lance retires because his front wheel's completely gnarled, and then Obviously, Lando's not much better off. He spins and then he retires. And to be fair, Norris thought that he had the pass done, that he managed to get up from 9th to 7th so he can get behind Piastri, and with the upgrades that he had on the medium tyres, which look really good on the McLaren, he might have been able to get past Piastri either through team orders or just general merit, and then he might have been able to try and catch up to Sainz, then Ricciardo. The only person who really benefits from all of this is Lewis. He then goes on to get 8th place on the road before he then gets a separate penalty. I'll talk more about that later. But realistically, no one really comes out of it on top. And the only person who gets penalised in any way, shape or form is Lando himself, the person who probably came off worst. Arguably Lance maybe, but he gets a €25,000 fine. It would have been 50, but it's then suspended because he goes to talk to the stewards. He didn't realise what he did was wrong, and he therefore regrets it. He apologises for it, and that's why he probably didn't get the full €50,000 whack. But he may get that again if he does a similar incident. It's kind of similar to what Lewis did in Qatar, where he and George made contact at turn 1, and he just walked over the live track back to the pits because they're already there, and he didn't ask for permission, Lando, before he did it. And according to the stewards report itself, they thought that Hamilton's car was the one that contributed to the collisions. But I would argue that Norris's positioning also contributed to the following events, because then Stroll had to block him, then Stroll was then going into Piastri, and things unfolded as they did. But at the same time, I don't think that Norris was to blame for the resulting incident with Alonso and Hamilton. No. And it does make me think, if this had happened on lap 2, Hamilton probably would have come away with a penalty because the stewards did deem him the most responsible, but no one was blamed wholly for it. And again, the turn 1 thing, it really does save many drivers bacon. And that whole other incident that Lewis was penalised for, where he didn't finish in 8th place and Tsunoda got his place back, it was to do with a pit lane speed limit. And he broke the speed limit by 10 kilometers an hour. That's a good 6 miles an hour. And when the speed limit is a 50 mile an hour limit and you go to 56, that can make all the difference in terms of injury. And also, it's not exactly responsible. So he got a drive-through penalty, but since it happened near the end of the race, it was a 20-second time penalty added to his overall sprint time. And I've seen many people online cry foul because Max Verstappen reportedly at the Italian Grand Prix last year sped in the pit lane, and all he got was a €500 fine. That was really a completely different scenario because that took place in practice too, instead of the actual race. I imagine that if Max had sped in the pit lane of 4 kilometers an hour above the speed limit in the race, he probably would have gotten a 10-second time penalty. But that's the whole thing. Lewis just didn't slow down in time. He clocked 10 kilometers an hour faster than he should have done, and thusly, he was culpable for it. In the end, none of the drivers ended up with any reward as Hamilton fell out of the points for that pit lane infringement. Had Hamilton not dive-bombed into turn 1, Alonso would have probably had gone into turn 1, given Stroll more space for him to then settle behind Ricciardo, who was also observing Sainz on the outside. So my logic is that if Hamilton had not been there and not dive-bombed into turn 1, the entire crash, that 3-car pile-up, would not have occurred. But then again, he went for the gap, and as Ayrton Senna once said, if you don't go for the gap, you're not a racing driver. And Lewis holds Senna in high regard, so this was the perfect opportunity to at least try. Going from 12th to 7th, had that been pulled off successfully, well, it kind of was, that would have been absolutely mighty. And as we saw, Magnussen and Hamilton had a great battle throughout the entire race, and although Magnussen did get penalties which he thought were mightily deserved, it was still interesting to see. So if it were up to me and I were a steward, I wouldn't give any time penalties because, again, it is turn 1, but I would have given Lewis and Lance formal reprimands. Not anything that would have compromised their overall race, but just a reminder that they were the ones who were probably the most accountable, since it was a major incident. The reason why I would have given Lewis a reprimand was because he probably could have done a little bit more to try and avoid the situation with Alonso and Stroll. He could have probably slowed down a little bit earlier, probably done a bit more right lock, so he might have gone over the curbs, it might have compromised his entry into turns 2 and 3 and the rest of the lap, but he would have been able to avoid the incident, so he could have done a little bit more to try and evade the whole thing. And as for Lance, he was turning right far more than he probably should have done. He could have easily tucked himself on maybe the left-hand side of Piastri, because there was still enough space between him and Lando was easily going wider and wider and wider, because as you can see from the onboard, Lance was just looking completely right. In fact, I think he's just looking at Ricciardo way ahead of him. It's similar to what he did in China. He was looking at a completely different car far away from him. Ricciardo is nowhere near him. Maybe he's compensating for China. Oh, I gotta keep my eyes firmly on Ricciardo. By the way, apparently he's still not apologised for that. Yeah, so maybe, Lance, you don't need to keep your eyes on Daniel the entire time. But either way, that's my take on it. You don't have to agree with me, and if you don't, that's perfectly fine. We don't agree with what the stewards do sometimes, so that's perfectly reasonable. I just wish to share my 2 penneth because I definitely stewed on it. And you might be able to stew on some more videos over here. I'm just going to magically put up this one. Go over there.